बजेगा भारत, झूमेगा भारत.
This is Bharat FM.
Good evening, India. Good evening, Singapore. And good morning, United States. And good day to all the listeners who are viewing this from around the world. So, we have a very special guest tonight. But let me tell you that Storytellers Cafe is a 30-minute show on Bharat FM every Sunday, 9 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 11:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And I'm your host, Usha Venkatraman. We have a very special guest from Singapore tonight. And let me introduce and welcome Kamini Ramachandran. Kamini, welcome
Hi.
to Hello, welcome
Hi,
to
Usha.
hello, welcome to Storytellers Cafe Kamini. It's a real honor for me as well as Storytellers Cafe and Bharat FM to welcome you. And to all you listeners out there, I know Kamini since 2012, Kamini. I met her in Singapore
That's
and
right.
she is a wonderful, I consider her my mentor because she is thoroughly professional and there is a lot of takeaway from her. So let me just dive into it. Our guest, as you know, is Kamini Ramachandran, a pioneer in the field of storytelling in Asia. Now, let me talk a little bit more about Kamini. You have to sit back and listen to this. Now, Kamini is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts with a bachelor's degree in English language and literature from the University of Reading, United Kingdom, and a master's degree in arts pedagogy and practice from Goldsmiths University of London. Kamini developed the narrative and storytelling module for the Expressive Arts Postgraduate Diploma at Singapore University of Social Sciences. Kamini also founded the not-for-profit organization, the Storytelling Center Limited, to advance the art of storytelling. Kamini is the creative force behind Moon Shadow Stories. That's the company she runs. Kamini has been featured twice at the Scottish International Storytelling Festival, Edinburgh, Federation of European Storytelling Conference, FEST, Festival Internazionale di Storytelling Roma in Italy, pardon my Italian, Festival at the Edge in England, Alden Beeson International Storytelling Festival in Belgium, Beyond the Border Storytelling Festival in Wales. It's beautiful. It's held in a castle. Believe me, it's fantastic. Sharjah International Storytelling Festival of United Arab Emirates. Hans Christian Andersen International Storytelling Festival in Denmark. Sydney International Storytelling Conference, Sydney. Chennai International Storytelling Festival, Chennai, India. Georgetown Festival in Penang, Malaysia, Cape Clear International Storytelling Festival in Ireland, and the London Literature Festival at the South Bank Centre. This is only to name a few of the festivals that Kamini has been invited to. Now, Kamini has been described as Singapore's most mesmerizing storyteller, and she is one of today's unique voices in the world of storytelling. And believe you me, I mean it. She is indeed unique. Welcome to Storytellers Cafe, Kamini. And I did cut short your Namaste. I cut short your introduction a little bit because it was going on. And he has pioneered the Young Storytelling Society. Kamini is going to talk about her work, everything, because this is going to be a little different Storytellers Cafe today. We will definitely get to hear a story from Kamini at the end of the session, but it's going to be a question Q&A between us because there's so much that she can throw light, and I know there are a lot of viewers who have tuned in, so sit back and enjoy listening to Kamini. So,
Thank you,
Kamini,
Sheila. Thank you.
let me throw open the session with my first question of the day. Um, the listeners of Storytellers Cafe would like to know your journey till today. Could you walk our listeners through your journey in storytelling till now, your trajectory?
So, in a nutshell, I stayed and was looked after by my maternal grandparents from a very young age. So, I spent a lot of my time with my late grandfather, and he was a storyteller. And so, without knowing it, you kind of you kind of absorb the family stories, the cultural and heritage stories, the traditional literature from someone like him, an elder in the family. And he told me the entire big epics of the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, then the Jataka tales, the Panchatantra, and of course the story of migration, because he left Kerala when he was a young man, only 14 years old, and he came to what was then known as Malaya and made his way there. So all these stories I inherited during that period of childhood staying with him. And I was the eldest grandchild. And so I got to spend the longest amount of time with him. So he spoke to me in Malayalam, he spoke to me in English, and he was fluent and excellent in Sanskrit. So I picked up a lot of mantras, chants, songs, verses, and of course the languages together with him. And without knowing it, that was my first introduction to oral tradition and to traditional folklore, mythology, legends, folk tales, fairy tales, and fables. So, of course, he's no more. He passed on many years ago. And I studied English language and literature, as you mentioned, at the University of Reading in UK. And a lot of my time was spent writing and reading and editing and doing a lot of what I would call away from the stage work. So behind the desk and alone work. It was only when I had my eldest son that I began to think about how I'd spent my childhood with my late grandfather and how a lot of the day was spent with stories and with song and a lot of mother tongue language as well. And that's when I stopped the writing and began to retell all these stories that I had inherited from him. And it was actually the birth of my eldest son that pivoted my work from being a writer and editor to someone who was going to perform these words. So I was really motivated by my late grandfather. And this, the journey of becoming a performing artist and a storyteller is very much influenced by him. Now, my childhood was also spent growing up in extremely rural places in Malaysia. My father worked in the plantations, which meant that every 1 to 3 years we would up and move to a different part of Malaysia. And so, to give you a little hint of my childhood, I went to 6 primary schools. So we moved all over the country. So, in this kind of isolated places, sometimes with no electricity until the generator was switched on only at 6 p.m., there was nothing much to do except to listen to others share stories and to read. So I read a lot, a voracious reader of anything and everything. So I think that informed my, progression in becoming someone that works with words and the spoken word especially. So in a nutshell, that's my journey.
Wow. It was just like a story. I was transported to the plantations in Malaysia. Beautiful. I didn't have a chance to visit a plantation in Malaysia, but I have visited other plantations in India. I can just imagine. Must have been a wonderful childhood, full of.
It was, and it was really a magical now that I look back as someone who lives in a very modern city with children who are brought up here in Singapore in an extremely fast-paced and modern city. My childhood literally had elephants, tigers, pythons, wild boars, all sorts of magical animals and all sorts of wonderful incidents that were just par for the course. I remember my father putting on his, boots and finding snakes coiled up inside. because of the humidity and the darkness. And this sort of encounters every day with animals and with nature was very common. And that also, I think, informed a lot of my practice in the kind of selection of material and the repertoire that I like to share.
Wonderful, Kamini. There is a lot in common. I too grew up in the northeast region of India, which
Mhm.
was not developed. My father was in the railways, and I have kind of fed a tiger cub in
Yes.
Darjeeling. I have some vivid memories of my childhood. But the ones which have kind of sustained. So that's wonderful. So, Kamini, how did you set up? Because when I met you, you were the creative director of Singapore International Storytelling Festival. How did the Storytelling International platform come about? How did you get into that?
So I think many years ago, probably about more than 15 years ago, we have a very strong body in Singapore called the National Book Development Council. And it used to be an offshoot of the National Library Board, but not anymore. Now it's a company limited by guarantee. And it used to be what they call a statutory board with the board of governors and all that. So, organizations evolve over time. So with a body like that, that championed reading, writing, authors, poetry, books, stories, publishing, editing, translation, you already have like an ecosystem and an institution that is promoting all of these things that are related to stories and how stories are presented in different forms. Now in Singapore, we also have a lot of languages being a multicultural place. So Tamil, Malay, and the Chinese language is also given equal importance in
Yes.
publishing and in the literary arts.
Mm.
So I met people who worked in the National Book Development Council, and that's how I became involved in the scene. And over time, being an artist and a performer and being able to produce my own shows and my own work and to create collaborations with musicians, with visual artists, with movement artists, and also thinking about raising funds and working with partners and stakeholders, I felt that when my boys were much older, that I now was ready to produce an entire festival on my own. And with the network that I'd created and the kind of like years of connections that you build up with different stakeholders locally and internationally. So Storyfest Singapore took form at the end of 2016, and our first edition was in 2017. So we've had 3 physical festivals with our co-presenter and partner, the Arts House. But this year we are going completely virtual and online. I think everybody around the world has had to do that because of the COVID-19 restrictions and regulations.
Yes.
But as I mentioned in one of my Facebook posts about Storyfest, art and culture has always faced challenges. We've always had threats, whether they were physical or material or whatever it was, psychological, emotional. We've always been threatened by different things around us. But artists and art, we've always found a voice and a way to continue. And we're really resilient. And I think storytellers and storytelling and those that don't work in a big ensemble, like an orchestra, for example, we are probably the easiest to be able to transition and to pivot and to be able to adapt to all these challenges that are thrown at us. So the global storytelling community, as you see, is thriving, right? COVID has not stopped us. In fact, it's brought us all closer. And what we're doing
Yes.
now is actually something that started during this lockdown period, right? This whole
Yes,
radio
absolutely.
station and this Storytellers Cafe.
Bharat FM is just, I think, 3 months old at the beginning of the lockdown, and Storytellers Cafe was launched on June 28th. So it's just about 3 weeks old. So you are one of our very first few guests. So, Kamini, that brings me to the second question about the ongoing virtual festival, Storyfest 2020. I had a chance to look at some of the performances and the young storytellers, because they're all the new kids on the block. And it was just amazing. I mean, I know, and for all you listeners out there, I know Kamini trains storytellers, and that was one of the takeaways in 2012 when she said that, and I do that in Mumbai Storytellers Society. So if my co-founders are listening, so I come from that lineage where, you keep telling, and tweaking and, toning, and, it's important. I learned that from you, and it is very important to have a fantastic presentation at the end of it. So can you tell us about Storyfest 2020?
So the Young Storytellers Mentorship Project is something that I started about 5 or maybe more than that years ago. I teach storytelling as a module at LaSalle College of the Arts. I also teach storytelling at the Singapore University of Social Sciences, and I conduct masterclasses and workshops for different agencies and educational institutions and individuals. I think along the way, about maybe in the mid 2000s, I realized that I've done a lot of work, and all of us are getting older day by day. And what's going to happen in the future? What's the succession plan? So I didn't want to, I had a grandfather who passed down his repertoire to me. And out of all the 9 grandchildren, I'm the only one who's practicing as a storyteller. So I didn't want this to be something that might just end with me. My boys love stories, they still listen to me, but so far none of them are showing any inclination of becoming someone like me or a practitioner. And so there were a lot of young people that I work with and teach who asked, how can they take this further? And so that's how I developed a very structured program where there's an apprentice and a mentor, and they're clearly guided. They are paid for the work that they do. They are platformed, and they understand what it is like to be a professional practitioner and how to slowly develop their repertoire. So they're trained to work with stories for children and stories for adults as well. So Storyfest Singapore this year platforms the young storytellers, as well as Singapore storytellers and spoken word artists who are very established and have their own practice and own niche, own style and own way of doing things. We also have a series of lecture presentations that are conducted by practitioners who work with story, but in an applied way. So we have mandala storytelling that looks into art therapy and narrative. So it's very visual, the storytelling. And then we have an academic who's a specialist in Malay literature who's going to talk about anthropomorphism or animals in stories and how they represent humans as metaphors. So in Jataka and Panchatantra are full of animals, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we have also a story slam practitioner who talks about competitive storytelling and personal storytelling, which is very different to what both of us do. We deal with material that's ancient and not really contemporary and not so much personal. So it's a variety of stories and genres that Storyfest showcases. So this year we've gone completely local because our international artists that I had planned for from last year, they couldn't travel. And what I didn't want to do was to, in this month of May and June, force people to record themselves and, send things under duress. I told all of them, I will bring you back next year so you can be yourself and completely relax and enjoy and perform as you should have this year.
Right. For all those of you who are listening, please go to Storyfest 2020. It's a fantastic lineup, and this will only stay online for the next 10 days, 17th to the 27th of July. So yeah, make the most of it. It's wonderful. I love the stories, and I plan to catch it during this week. And Kamini, now moving on from Storyfest, there is a renaissance, storytelling renaissance happening in the whole world, particularly in Asia. And I would like you to throw some light, if you've been following the storytelling explosion that's happening in India as well as in other parts of Asia. So, what would you like to tell our listeners? Is there any takeaway, any pointers that we need to keep in mind?
I think it's always encouraging to see any kind of art form flourish, especially in the 21st century, where we already have so much distraction and we have so many things that are perhaps not traditional and is extremely modern and continuously innovating and presenting the new. So what I like is from young people to established practitioners around Asia, as you mentioned, people are going back to their roots and having pride in your culture, in your mother tongue languages, in your heritage and tradition, and combining and collaborating with a multitude of art forms, the storytelling renaissance has a huge and responsible role to play in identity and in a feeling of rootedness. So, if carefully practiced and thought through and well planned, it can really allow parent and child bonding. It can allow young people to feel a sense of belonging and ownership. And it can build and foster so much tolerance between different cultures. So, whether the cultures and experiences are local or even if they're international, a good story, well told, allows people to sit back and think, that is what it feels like to be in your shoes. That's why you do things and say things in that way. Now I understand because I've listened to your story. And immediately there is no us and them. So, this kind of understanding through culture is probably what our role is in this huge renaissance that's happening globally, not just in Asia. But to be proud of who you are and where you come from, and to embrace what is local. And a lot of us maybe come from mixed marriages, and we have children who are growing up in a in a third culture, and
Yeah,
so they may not speak their mother tongue languages, right? So how
yeah.
can we, as parents from two different cultural backgrounds and with different languages and speaking a common language like English, how can we bring our oral tradition and equip that child with a sense of belonging? So this, I feel, is how my work is informed here in Singapore as an educator, as a teaching artist, and also as a performer. So when I look at my audience and when I look at people who come and attend workshops, what is it that they need now in this society?
Okay. And storytellers, I absolutely agree with you because the Storytellers Cafe is also going to foster and encourage in the storytelling in the different Indian languages. We had Jiva Raghunath start off in Tamil, and
Okay.
we are going to have Marathi in Marathi language, Gujarati, Oriya, Bengali, Telugu, Kannada. So
Yes.
this is what is to happen, and the very traditional storytellers who are actually unsung heroes. I'm going to bring some of them to Storytellers Cafe. They are in the next lineup. It's actually going to be pretty interesting. So thank you for talking about the language storytelling, because that's one of the our I would say we want to promote that at Storytellers Cafe.
I think that's so
Uh,
important. Even if you don't understand a foreign language, storytellers are incredibly expressive, especially the very traditional art practitioners. So you don't really need to know every single word, but by looking at them and looking at the gestures, you understand.
Absolutely. Can you just tell us about a couple of lines, throw some light to our young storytellers, listeners? This is particularly to storytellers about the storytelling etiquette and its ethics. I would say Niti Shastra, like Chanakya's Niti Shastra, because this is all the Niti Shastra in storytelling, which is really somewhere extinct and needs to be revived.
One of the things that I teach in my module at SUSS for narrative and storytelling is ethics in storytelling. The most important thing is to make sure you have permission to tell a particular story, especially if it's a personal story or if it is a story that you heard someone tell and you would like to tell it the same way or the same style or in the same manner as that storyteller. The second thing that I tell my class is you must acknowledge and you must credit. So if you don't have enough background in the many versions of that story, because sometimes a story that you hear may have been an adaptation and there may be multiple versions. So it's very important to actually inform your audience how much you know, when you heard it, how you plan to tell it, what your sources and references are, and perhaps who influenced you or inspired you in telling the story in this way. So acknowledgement, crediting, and making sure that you have permission to retell. That would be one of the fundamental ethical points in storytelling.
I think we lost Usha.
Oh dear, did we lose Usha?
Looks like uh, we'll just wait
Yeah, we'll
to get
reconnect.
her back. Yeah, let's wait to have her back.
Yeah.
So, Kamini, while Usha is joining us, let me ask you something about storytelling. So there are storytelling in different languages all over the world, right? Uh, how do you attempt to help people understand a story in a language that they are not comfortable with? Um, how would you do that?
So this usually happens when I'm invited to a festival in a country that's perhaps not so familiar with English, and English is not taught in schools and is not even a second language. So sometimes they have translators. So you work side by side with another professional storyteller who will translate together with you. But sometimes you're left completely alone. So that's where your eyes, your facial expression, your hand gestures, your body, and sometimes using very simple words and repeating, and also allowing the audience to help you with certain words. So sometimes asking them and pointing, like to tree or to the sky,
Right.
and asking them for their language, the words to help you out. So I find that if you show a little bit of accommodation and a little bit of informality and slow down, then you're able to bridge these gaps.
Right, right. So, well, Usha is back. I will let her take over from here.
Sorry, like we said, we need to pray to Wi-Fi, just this way. Anyway, Kamini, I'm back. Thanks, Ashish, for taking over. Kamini, and since we are coming to an end, Storytellers Cafe, we can't let you leave without telling us a story, even if it's a short story.
Short story. Okay. So one of the stories that I tell very often is from a collection by folklorist A.K. Ramanujan. And it's a story about what happens to you when you don't tell stories. And it's from the south of India, and it's called Tell It to the Walls. Once upon a time, a very long time ago, there lived an old widow woman. Her husband had passed on, and she was now all alone. So she decided to go and stay with her two sons, her two daughters in law, and her many, many, many grandchildren. Now, all of them lived together in a very small hut. You would think that in a house with so many people, there would be so much noise and so much conversation. But that old widow woman, she was all alone. Everyone was so busy, no one had time for her. Now, the old widow woman, she had so many stories she wanted to share. She had so many sorrows and so much sadness that she wanted to share. So one day she went up to her two sons. She made them sit down and she began to talk to them. But they stopped her and they said, "Mother, can't you see we have work to do? We do not have time to listen to you." The old widow woman then went into the kitchen and made her two daughters-in-law sit down, and she began to talk to them. They turned around and they wrung their hands. "Mother, can't you see? We have to cook, we have to clean, and we have to feed all these hungry children. We do not have time to sit here and talk to you." The old widow woman then went out of the house and she gathered all her many grandchildren. She made them sit down and she started to tell them a story. But one by one, they began to turn around and look at their toys and at their friends. They waved to the old widow woman, "Grandmother, we have to go and play with our friends." And they ran off. Now, as time passed, the old widow woman began to grow larger and larger and larger in size, with all those untold stories deep inside of her. Now, this became a problem for her family. Her son said that she was taking up too much space, and her daughters-in-law said she was eating too much food. Hurt and upset, the old widow woman walked out of that little hut. She walked all the way out of that village, up the hill, until she reached what must have been once upon a time a house. There was no roof, no doors, no windows, only the four bare walls stood standing. The old widow woman stood in front of the first wall and began to weep all her sorrow against her eldest son, and that wall broke. She turned to the next wall and shouted all her anger against her first daughter-in-law, and that wall broke. She turned to the next one and began to sob all her sadness against her youngest son, and the wall crumbled. She looked at the last wall and she screamed all her anger against her youngest daughter-in-law, and the wall came crashing down. The widow woman looked down and she was surrounded by dust and stones and rubble. But as she looked down, she realized that she had lost all that she had gained in her wretchedness. She was herself once more. And that widow woman turned around and walked and walked and walked up that hill. Now, I don't know whether she went back home. I don't know where she went to, but I would like to believe that she's still walking now. So that's my story, adapted from A.K. Ramanujan's Tell It to the Walls.
Thank you, Kamini. That was such a wonderful story. And I think it's very appropriate, right now, what everyone is going through. So please don't store or stifle anything inside you. Tell it to the walls.
Exactly.
Tell it to the trees, to the birds, to anything that you can get. You need to. So
yeah.
What a wonderful story. I think a lovely way to end our evening. And thank you once again, Kamini. Storytellers Cafe is indeed very happy to have hosted you today as our guest. And for all you listeners out there, every Sunday Storytellers Cafe will be bringing you yet another guest storyteller. So stay tuned, look out for the notification on Facebook, and you can watch the live streaming on Facebook. So Kamini, thank you so much. And I thank Bharat FM for, having this Storytellers Cafe. They decided that, yes, when I suggested it to them, they said, of course, and you have complete carte blanche to do what you want with it. So here we are.
Thanks, Usha, and thanks, Bharat FM. It's been such a nice evening. I mean, it's almost midnight here in Singapore. It's past midnight, actually, but I've enjoyed myself. Thanks a lot. And so nice to see you again after so long.
Yeah, thank you.
This is Bharat FM.
बजेगा भारत झूमेगा भारत.
FM.
बजेगा भारत झूमेगा भारत.
This is Bharat FM.
All right, we are